Professor Cho didn't think an introduction was necessary because you know who he is, but I thought I might say just a brief word. He is SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor here at the University of Buffalo. Welcome back. We have, for those of you that are philosophy alumni, we have a few on hand, and welcome to the rest of you as well. This is the first time we're having a homecoming lecture and reception and other. This happens at other departments, other places, and I don't know. We'll see how. We'll see if we can make it a tradition. We'll see. But Professor Cho has graciously agreed to provide a lecture this evening. I thought he might be a good choice for this, given the large number of students he's taught over the years. He taught his first course at UB in 1962. That's about 10 years after receiving his PhD. About 5 years after receiving his PhD from the University of Heidelberg. So Professor Cho has held visiting positions at a variety of places over his career: in Korea at Songsil University, Osaka, Bochum, University of Texas, University of Frankfurt, been visiting research professor at the Husserl Archives in Cologne, and he knows more languages than you. So we're very pleased to have him give this lecture this evening. So it's going to be entitled Self and Other, Reflection on the Minimalist Virtue of the Tao. So thank you very much, Dr. Cho.
The topic needs some explanation. Self and other, well, familiar reference to subject and object, or it could be alterity and identity. But the most important part is actually the two last words, minimalist virtue. This is my own way of describing the Daoist virtue. And here the first thing I should like to tell you is that in Chinese tradition, nature shared the virtue with the human being. Well, in old Greek language also, when you say arete, this was not confined to human virtues. If a horse is excellent, some bird is capable of looking through the night sky and then catch the prey, such excellence which is natural to certain species, animals were considered to be virtue and virtuous. Now, of course, here the major distinction that has to be drawn at first is the way traditional Chinese philosophy looked at nature is so vastly different from Western way of looking at nature. As you know, Plato's school was the first one that introduced the disjunction, as they call it, between three major philosophical disciplines, the first one being logic, second ethics, and the third physics. Physics belonged earlier to philosophy. I feel that the classical Chinese way of thinking was somewhat closer to ancient Western way than to what we know nowadays. And certain affinity, for example, microcosmic way of looking at the universe. Human individual is the smallest unit. We got three parts, the soul or mind, and the heart or will, and then nutritional part is considered to be stomach, which takes care of our health. And if it's a bit larger, then we got society. Society has three classes, such as philosopher king, guardian class, and then other people like farmers and carpenters and so on, who are in the industry and taking care of the dwelling, the food, clothing, etc. The same microcosmic way of looking at the universe and ourselves existed in all the ancient religions and philosophy, to my knowledge. And recently I found that Whitehead, when he delivered in 1927 Gifford lecture, he actually introduced Plato in a very different light than before. Plato's works were centered on government, justice, and love, and so on, but there was scattered mentioning of the society and human being as a larger and smaller universe, and their characteristic was typically organic or organicistic. I read some people like Whitehead, Dewey, and even George Santayana. And I was struck by the fact that even though Santayana spent some common period of time with Whitehead, I wondered whether they talked to each other. They are so fundamentally different in their way of looking at philosophy, especially contemporary philosophy, which could be characterized as constructivistic. Now, the same work of Kant, which of course distinguished between thing in itself and the world of appearance, which we can know for certainty because our so-called innate a priori forms are cut to understand the world of phenomena as governed by certain natural laws. And this same work of Kant was viewed in two radically different ways by Santayana and Whitehead. Whitehead, in his Process and Reality, praised Kant for having grasped the essential structure of modern science. Modern science is subjectivism, but this subjectivity and subjectivism can be readily translated into objectivism because the formal a priori laws inherent in our human reason is common to all people. And since we do not know things in themselves, we just understand the appearance side. And so the laws that we can grasp as applicable to world of nature is not really applicable, for example, cause and effect applicable to things in themselves. It might have some laws inherently, but we have no knowledge. We can just think. Those laws are thinkable but unknowable. That's the answer Kant gave. Now, Santayana was harsher. His book, Egotism, it's not egoism, in German philosophy was written in 1916, right in the middle of First World War. And who was he? Santayana, he taught at Harvard, as I said, but he was Spanish. Lived most of his life in America and had American passport. But the last 5 years were spent in Italy, and many years were also spent in Spain and London, and also in Berlin. So he was truly international. He should be one who has known the German philosophical tradition and how it was received by people like Croce in Italy, who had written the book on Hegel, what is alive and dead in Hegel. And of course, he has known all his American colleagues. He devastatingly criticized Kant and all the followers of German idealism for this habit of reducing the reality into the narrative about oneself. So the whole world is sucked into the self, the inner world, and what is the mere reflection of self and self-consciousness is projected again as if it is a reality per se out there. Whitehead didn't make that kind of mistake. He was very much appreciative of Kant's accomplishment and described this as really having caught the essence of modern structuralist, constitutive way of interpreting the universe. Now, when I move away from Western tradition, we have, of course, Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. And once I remember reading Nishida Kitaro, famous Japanese Kyoto school head, and he has written in 1940, still at the beginning of the Second World War, a short article, no more than 40 pages, on Eastern and Western world, the difference seen under metaphysical perspective. And he named Western philosophy, starting with Greek natural philosophy, as interested in the question of being, its ontology, whereas Western world is absorbed in the question of its negation, nothingness. Being and nothingness are two captions that each characterize the tradition of Western philosophy on the one hand and the other Eastern philosophy. The first paragraph I have here is from John Dewey, and you might take a look at it. Breathing, he said, is an affair of air as truly as of lungs. Walking implicates the ground as well as the legs, as taken from human nature and conduct. In these words, Dewey describes the basic organic and symbiotic mode of interaction between human being and his environment. A certain harmony pre-exists between a man's energies and his surroundings, which support and help accomplish his purposes. To be sure, Dewey distinguishes involuntary physiological functions like breathing and digesting from acquired dispositions like speech and honesty. But even acquired dispositions are owed to man's surrounding world, such that those successfully performed functions must be seen effectively as something let free. And I have in the parenthesis the remark that it is understood in the sense of the middle voice grammar by the ambient conditions. Dewey calls it natural freedom, which is prior to political freedom and is its condition. Taken together, the natural and socio-cultural environment in which human being dwells constitutes the enabling ground. This is not a technical term, that's my way of extrapolating what might call conditional possibility for all possible forms of creativity, thought, faith, art, and other sundry practices. Now, here comes an inserted remark taken from the 3rd century BC, Daoist Zhuangzi. In order to walk, a man uses no more of this earth than the soles of his 2 feet will cover. But suppose one cut away the ground round his feet till one reached the yellow spring, probably a very distant place, would these patches of his patches of ground still be of any use to him for walking? On a serious note, we must admit that the patches of ground left after removing all the seemingly useless surrounding surface were never adequate to support the walking in real time. surplus margin of cushion area is always needed. Even psychologically, the unused wider area would be something appreciated, as it gives an assurance to the walker, lest he should feel he is treading on a tight rope with each step. If we think we have overheard a certain Daoistic ring in the way Dewey was speaking of this natural freedom, namely, which precedes political freedom and actually grounds it, we have not really committed any anthropomorphic fallacy. For Dewey actually feels we have gravely misunderstood and underappreciated nature and gave it a bad name, as the British proverb goes. Certain positive moral epithets could be easily restored to the way nature comports. And indeed, it is the purpose of my present lecture to have you sample the food of thought contained in the idea of selfless virtue of Taoism. The reason I prepared a very short reprint was because there were so many Chinese characters I wanted to show you while I was drawing it and explaining the meaning. The many Chinese characters are ideograms, they are pictograms. So if you have a horse, fish, elephant, you actually draw very closely the figure, elephant, somewhat like this.
I don't know how to use that one. That one.
Does it look like an elephant? The four legs and tail and so on. All Chinese language countries such as mainland China, Taiwan, and Singapore have simplified. That's mostly the phenomena after the end of the Second World War. Japan, among them, as the first country, tried to limit the number of Chinese characters in everyday newspaper so that high school students will not suffer under excessive weight, the demand for original Chinese characters. They limited probably to 1,500 for daily newspaper. So in the process, even before that, simplification has officially become rules. The Chinese people have a little simplify this. But this is no longer the elephant. This is doing and making, something like that. And this is a famous word, way. If you add the negation of this, with non-action. This is an action. Why human action has anything to do with the elephant? According to the etymological dictionary, elephant, of course, was not as popular as widespread in China. Maybe southern China, yes. An elephant was trained in order to roll the log. You cut the huge tree, and a horse or a cow are not strong enough to move those materials. Apparently, elephant was used. And a young boy would climb up the back and then use his finger and fingernails to scratch behind the ear. So make a left turn, right turn, to stop, squat, and so on. And therefore, this word, which is a simplification of elephant, and on top of the head, the trace of 3 nails with fingernails, shows an artificial training and use of animals which is going against nature. Something falsified, unnatural. The word came to symbolize unnatural activity of human, which in the Daoist scale of value is inferior and must be avoided. If you really want to keep within the permissible range of activity, you have to at least, when in agriculture you have to use a cow or a horse or more, domesticated animals, that's fine. But using an elephant for agricultural purpose or building a house and so on, that seemed to be to them very artificial, concocted, unnatural. Now, human being, when this originally it may have been more graphical, but this human figure, if it becomes a radical, it has to be pushed to the left side, okay? And then you have this word, doing. Already it is an artificial action, training elephant to do something quite unnatural. But if it is emphasized by inserting the radical signifying human being, then it means false, not genuine, and therefore it has a low value as compared to the natural way. Tao's way and human way are diametrically opposed. I think the Daoistic philosophy capitalizes on this major distinction: morality, or speech, or consciousness, and all the actions that are done by human being. And historically speaking, Taoism referred to Confucianism as the typical exemplification of this artificiality. The rituals, or the rules and laws, and behaviors as an individual, and of course within the family. I have to advance that the concept of individuality or personhood didn't exist in China the way we know it from the West. And so human being is primarily regarded in terms of the membership, especially family. When even now somebody is introduced to a newcomer, a friend and so on, we do not simply say he is a John. That's not enough. He must be mentioned as the brother or as a cousin or somebody who is more senior, who is better known socially and so on. And this relationship is always part of the way of introducing somebody new, right? And the smallest unit, essential unit, is always family. That has contributed to the establishment of grammar and the basic logical connections. When you have an individual, he or she is a subject or substance. But subject and substance is standing on its own. It's an individual. But idea of individuality being so rare and not fully developed, we always have relationship in mind, and the minimum relationship requires two persons, right? And so two is written like this, just as here. And here's a human being, again the same radical. This is the basic moral attribute of being human. And only when human beings are not isolated, but standing a long ways or vis-a-vis to another second human being, there is what is called human-heartedness. This is interpreted as a human-heartedness, human-heartedness, okay? Takes two persons. Let's consider a non-human interpretation of the relationship. In the Western world, the subject or subjectivity, okay, has a single individual, and therefore, when you are describing this person is always the subject, the noun. And when you are describing this person's relationship to another person, the another person becomes an object to that first person. And this relationship between the two always is in terms of either I am the subject or I myself becomes the object. When two equal persons are standing as a human being, then subject-object relationship does not prevail here. It's reciprocal, okay? And the role can be easily reversed. None is higher than the other. And this can be applied to when persons are not just 2, 3, 4, 5. We have weekly designation of first day of the week, second, third, and fourth. And this is patterned after the yin-yang. That means the solar and lunar, or the sunny side of the hill as opposed to the shadowy side of the hill, depending on how, the sun rising from the east is illuminating one side of the hill, and then the same hill is seen on the shadowy side when the light moves to the west. Therefore, it's false to understand the yin-yang relationship as a dualistic. No? That means the same hill, same mountain, illuminated in the morning from the east and in the evening from the west. John Toynbee has rightly understood when he was describing the laws that govern historical world. The Eastern world did not really dualistically think. It was just one and the same world, one and the same relationship, mutually complementing each other. And therefore, within a family, husband and wife are supposed to form a unity rather than individual. In the West, they are still individuals, and when they are separated, legally, they have the equal amount of say, and whatever the possession or the income should be shared, that will be distributed equally. Individualism is very hard to understand for the traditional Eastern perspective. Now, here, cause and effect is a very important concept, isn't it? The science stands and falls depending on how firmly cause and effect relationship can be established. Kant had a big problem because the foundation of this concept was shaken by Hume's empiricism and skepticism. Now, it's a linear. You cannot expect the effect to produce the cause. Cause is always temporarily ahead, and from the cause, the effect is deduced. This relationship becomes not linear, instead reciprocal in the Eastern understanding of the basic human relationship. Instead of two persons, they usually envision threesomeness. when three persons are together, you do not have who is the head and who is the tail, who is the cause and who is the effect, or who is the giver and who is the receiver. Children play games, and when it's a ball game, who throw the ball first, when they decide the sequence, then they have this scissors, paper, and rock or stone, right? And their relationship is peculiar. There is not one who is above the other two. Scissors can be broken by a hard stone, right? And the hard stone is stronger than scissors, but it can be wrapped up by a cloth or a paper. And that paper is cut by the scissors. And therefore, I am to the left, stronger than the person to the left, but I am weaker than the person to my right. This is the way they look at the human relationship. Nobody individually is above, but you know the role played by subject and substance in the traditional epistemology and metaphysics. The relationship becomes a little more complicated when you have not the minimum 3 persons, but 5. So you can easily see, we call that ambient causality, because not so much the substance itself, but the surrounding situation, the background is more important. And also reticular causality, which means not a linear progression, but like the net, fisher net. Fisher net doesn't work if it's only, cause and effect or linear combination. Instead, at least a triangle or more, reasonably 4 or 5 knots are there. And one influences the other, but this person or agent does not always remain passively. It has the possibility and opportunity to influence another. And that other person is not only influenced by this, but can influence another person. It has all sorts of implications. In China, traditionally, settling the issue or controversy with the means of law is considered to be very inhuman. That's mechanical. And so what you might call nowadays as out-of-court settlement was the rule of the day. And a very basically corrupt person, corrupt mind would take a friend to the court and have the court to settle the issue of borrowed money that was not paid on time. Lao Tzu's Dao De Jing has one such example. It was a bamboo, depending on the size, the bamboo skin will be peeled, and it was used as a tally, and you inscribe the name of the person, the amount you borrowed or you lent, and then, other sheet of paper or cloth is more fragile, and therefore they must have used preferably the bark of bamboo. When the time comes, say at the end of the month, you are expecting the debtor and you are the creditor. The debtor is going to repay the money that he borrowed from you. Strangely, that particular verse in Dao De Jing mentions this man, who is an accomplished person, is holding the debtor side of the tally. He is the one who had the money and lent this to his friend. And he knew perhaps the friend is poor enough, he could certainly keep the promise by a certain date. And so he would never force the friend to pay with the interest. Take a look at Shakespeare's story, The Merchant of Venice, the Shylock. Money lender, the usurer would take if the money is not returned or repaid with interest by a certain date, a pound of flesh from his arm or something like. That's very harsh, right? Some people say the reason why Western world, with the spirit of business and commercial and economical success, emerged stronger and stronger over the centuries, is because this legality and strong, very harsh regulation of the debtor-creditor relationship. Whereas in the East, you can't do such a thing among friends. Or if you are an accomplished person, okay, even if you have money to collect from a debtor, you are not supposed to insist on payment so legalistically. And this might have contributed to the kind of chaotic state of economy. The money lending was almost not, accruing the kind of interest that you have envisioned. So wealthy people had the tendency of just hoarding money instead of circulating the money. Money, only when it is circulated, it will bring more of the profit. When Ford Company, the famous T model in 1920s, the idea of this capitalist was to manufacture as many cheap cars as possible so that many people can go to distant places quickly, cheaply, and get a job and work 5 days a week and come back and spend the weekend not in Chotopa but in the church. That way, the money has its strength in circulation, being utilized, not put in an urn, earthen urn buried underground. That's money hoarding, and it doesn't bring any profit or interest or productivity. All sorts of economical relationship, positive or negative, can be explained when you go back to this concept of how you treat another human being. Is it democracy or is it hierarchy? Or is it more social and based on family relationships? Often family relationship is very disturbing. How distant related. All sorts of people just come and stay. I have, for instance, in my home, about 17 people sleeping overnight for several days. And you understand what that means. You have to cook, you have to provide a bed and everything. And it's a disastrous thing. Well, so the logical central notion of the self or identity, which you pick up from my title, self and other, that has this kind of background. In the West, self is autonomous, the free, it is always independent, basically, and the other means something that is less important. It could be another person, but it could be also non-human being. the other is a reference to another person, but the alterity also is a reference to nature. Now, if you juxtapose human world with the world of nature, nature never was the subject, and human being an object that is subordinated to nature. That is the history of the West. When for the first time, around 1815, Hegel introduced the history of world philosophy as the first, actually. Before his time, you had medieval or early modern or pre-Socratic, all those periods, but never in one monolithic structure, the world history. And Hegel consummated world history because truth existed only as a system, right? What about a falsehood? Wrong, unverified results such as alchemy. Hegel would recognize the role, the positive role of alchemy as the forerunner through the mistake, the better method and better experimentation and observation were stimulated, and it has, as a mistake, served the purpose of correcting the subsequent result. And astrology preceded astronomy. When you look at those two simple examples, you can find why Hegel said the truth is from cover to cover. Don't just read the table of content or index, And then, in order to persuade students to read his own book from cover to cover, he ended up writing 45-page introduction. Reading introduction should be that long. Why am I talking about Hegel? He introduced the world history and justified the exclusion of the chapter on China and India by writing 70 pages, the justification to exclude. Why China, for example, has to be excluded? It's because physical sun may rise from the east, but the sun of reason rises only from the west. And after Eastern world, Japan and China opened their doors and imported and assimilated Western science, and in certain cases even surpassed in the development of certain areas of science the Western world. Hegel said that is not going to be the victory of the East or over West. Instead, same West has overcome the mind of the Eastern world and converted them to this science. Now, there's a very prejudicial Western way of looking at themselves and at other countries who try to learn from the West. So when Hegel said, after reading a few chapters of Tao Te Ching, there's nothing that he can pick up, and about the Confucian so-called 5 classic works, he also threw them away and said, we can learn nothing from Confucius. It would have been better for the fortune of Confucius if his works were not translated at all in European languages. Then, he was still wrapped in mystery, and like all the mystery, many people didn't understand and therefore could not easily criticize it. But there was an interesting footnote to that. 100 years before Hegel's time in 17th century, it was Leibniz who first showed the sign of absorbing interest of those things of Chinese. And he asked many missionaries, either from Rome or from Paris, who were dispatched to China, bring back information about certain ways of doing things, how to dye the silk with golden, gold or silver, and how China, being such a vast populated country and having flat land only, the irrigation has to be mechanized so that the vast area would be optimal rice producing field. Were they using windmill or a water mill? All those questions, 36 questions were given to the Western missionaries and they brought back. And also, already at the age of 14, Leibniz started learning the Chinese language. Of course, the basic motive of Leibniz was to eventually convert Russia, the huge country, and another large country, China, into Christianity. But the method that he had used was peculiar. When some of the missionaries sent ahead of the time and came back, didn't consider it worth the money and also personnel expenses, because all the Chinese were atheists. They didn't know the God as the creator. They didn't have the notion of ultimate substance. The Aristotelian logic was alien to them, and the Christian theory of creation of the world was also alien to them. Leibniz, however, had an argument which apparently had some success. If the Chinese had science, especially mathematics, and in the mathematics they had moved ahead of West by several thousand years, 1,000 or 2,000, I'm not sure, to find binary arithmetic, then the Chinese must have had an antiquity in which they were far ahead of West, and only through the inertia of history they have become lazy, or so there was a lapse, and so they have forgotten what they have accomplished many, many centuries ago. What was the binary arithmetic that Leibniz found among the Chinese? It was Book of Change, I Ching, and Book of Change uses hexagrams, those sticks, unbroken stick in between broken in two parts, shorter sticks. And the combination of them, some 81 or 80 some possibilities. That is thrown in the midair. And as they fall down on the ground, this constellation, the combination, would reveal something. The Chinese have done this with the panther of a tortoise. It's burnt, and then cracks that were generated by the heat is red, and you have those symbols that pointing, for example, direction north or south, east. When you are about to sail into the ocean for some kind of commercial purposes, and it has to be auspicious sign that those, such symbols show. Or there's a marriage in the family, and a certain family bears in the family name the symbol of metal. Okay? It's like Friday in Chinese. And the partner bears another symbol, water. So water family and metal family, wooden family and earth family, moon family and sun family. All those things are, the signs of nature which are far more important than man-made symbols. And they wanted, accordingly, trusted the signs that were generated by those symbols, which are called Yiging's hexagram. Leibniz had too excessive benefit of interpretation. He saw that Chinese had the knowledge of binary arithmetic ahead of the Westerners. And therefore, even though in theology or religion, the Chinese didn't have the notion of substance or creator God, they were almost equal and should be treated equal. Leibniz's motto was Propagatio Dei Peascientas, propagation of God, Christian God, through the means of science. And therefore, it doesn't matter. You can teach Chinese medicine, astronomy, or mathematics, and if Chinese have absorbed this knowledge, then they were pulled to the equal standard where the Westerners had also had a logic and epistemology and theology and the notion of substance. This we call philosophy of accord rather than one-sided assimilation. And therefore, in a way, Leibniz had actually used the Chinese recipe, the way of treating another person as an equal partner rather than unilaterally or one-sidedly. The one is the teacher, the other is the disciple. Well, here, John Dewey comes very close. John Dewey and also Whitehead. I said earlier, Whitehead read cosmology consisting in the correspondence between small universe and larger universe. Organic or organicistic way of looking at the universe. That was present in Plato. What does it mean? In our modern times, when mechanization has rampantly gone wild and we see everywhere mechanization, and we have lost sight of organic cooperation and correlation between humans and nature, world of nature. And so recently, well, actually in 1960s, the ecological issue flared up. And someone who wrote ecological, the roots of ecological crisis, historical roots of ecological crisis, is Lynn White, okay, emphasized the importance of going back to the organic world picture and emphasize the cooperative and giving and taking rather than one-sidedly exploiting nature. And organic substances must be given back to nature so that it can recoup and capable of yielding agricultural products the way it has been doing annually. Nowadays, people have started to exploit nature by feeding chemical fertilizer. Well, nature reacts. Nature is docile. And then instead of one crop, you have 2 or even 3 crops a year, but that wouldn't last. The fatigue phenomenon sets in. And for this reason, nature must be also reinterpreted not as a docile, ever obedient maid or something, but should be respected. Nature must be, in other words, taken as the partner of stewardship. It was the idea that has become very widespread now. Even the Old and New Testaments are being read under the new light. For example, Francis of Assisi becomes a very respectable figure because he lived together with other animals instead of shooting at the animals as predatory, as wild and so on. Whenever he showed up, crows and other flying birds would descend from the sky and stop on his head or on his shoulder. And you have this Christmas time picture card showing lion and deers and other herb-eating animals sitting together peacefully. That is something that also Christians were able to envision instead of blindly obeying what said in the Genesis. All those things were, the meaning flying fowls, creeping cattle, swimming fishes were made for human beings. Conquer them, go, multiply, and the earth must become the inhabitant dominated by human beings. That is now becoming obsolete. And for this reason, ecologists are throwing fresh look at ancient Chinese literature and finds sources of idea supply. We are here poor in ideas because in actual progress of our cities and societies, we have not, witnessed the possibility of living together with the animals. They have to go to the ancient sources and how the flood problem, how the drought problem, and over exploitation of fish or animal and so on have been treated and resolved in the historical record. In other words, we have to look at nature more as a partner than as something that is given by God simply to conquer. This cannot be done by ecological innovation alone. Fundamentally, philosophical and even religious ideas have to be reformulated. You see, Exodus chapter 20, verse 25 says, "When thou willst to build my stone statue," that is Jehovah saying to people, Jewish people, "thou shalt not raise a hammer upon the stone, because this tool is going to defile nature." This attitude of looking at nature as something pristine and even sacred existed in all antiquities. But nowadays we don't do that. We consider it anachronism and anthropomorphism and anthropocentrism. So church should not be blamed for spreading such an idea which is clearly human-centered. After all, human being is made in the image of God, and many people, even if they do not doctrinally subscribe to that, they just actually practice this unlimited conquest and mechanization. Mechanical world picture is easy to control, and it has made a spectacular success. And it has become also fashionable in philosophy. Now, philosophy is basically an argument under the presupposition that Newtonian mechanistic universe is what we are living. That is, we are not living inside. We have separated ourselves from mechanical universe, and mechanical universe is at arm's length. And so it's very easy to look at it in a neutral way. We are not affected by that. And the mechanical world picture is causally explainable. And product and the result is always communicable easily, logically. Okay? But when it becomes a live universe, then the organic structure of, well, you have to perhaps change your way of looking at it from the mechanistic Newtonian method to Leibniz's own monadological method of looking at it. That is the philosophical challenge we face. What about still more time? 8 o'clock. I didn't have a conclusion here. I simply indicated what, along what line, along what trajectory we should further go on to think. Here is a quotation from, this one is Lao Tzu, Dao De Jing, on page second. Highest good is like water. It benefits everything and everybody, nor does it discriminate between good and bad people. After having served with beneficial work, it seeks the lowest place to stay and never claims any recognition. When I use the word minimalist virtue, it is this humble attitude Lao Tzu had in mind, really beneficial to other people, even beneficial to politics. Okay, he gave all sorts of advices and recommendations to politicians. It's not wrong to say the whole book Lao Tzu wrote in 81 verses is meant as an advice to ruling feudal lords, kings and princes. And what's the gist of the advice? Small government. Small is a good government. And people in Washington bandy this slogan without knowing the true meaning. It's not necessarily, states rather than the federal government should have more power. The power itself is anathema. It is a discrete way of being beneficial. That's the virtue, okay? The virtue of water, well, it's not a personified anthropocentric way of projecting human way of looking at things to inanimate, inorganic substance like water. Can you live without water? We are drawing benefit, just as Dewey has recognized, and he started reinterpreting the meaning of nature. Nature has its own freedom ahead of human political freedom. That's what he said. Okay. It's a very significant statement. He is along the line of ahead of the time, before ecological crisis has become so dominant. He was preaching the importance of somehow respecting the life in nature rather than reducing nature to machines. Okay? And so I would like to conclude by drawing your attention to the meaning of water. Water has become also very precious. In China, it's going to be a real problem. They have dug under Mao Zedong hundreds, thousands of wells, and then the level of earth sank because of this dried out land. And recently, the hydroelectric power plant that has been, planted also caused some problem. Well, China is practicing population control as well, and I wish well that they would not be sold on the idea of capitalistic expansion. Instead, read more of their own classical document and become more wise and sagacious and develop a human social and international relationship somewhat based on small is good and not doing beneficial things to left and right, and never claim credit for that. This is my last word.